On the next panel, which is panel 2, we will be talking about how the African Continental Free Trade Area has helped or is leading to the Africa we want. We will be looking at that, focusing on the agenda for Africa's agenda for 2063, and how that vision looks like, how peaceful it's going to look like, and how integrated is going to help Africa to sustain economic growth. To lead this discussion, we would like to invite Bloor, who is the president of the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business. We are happy to have him here today. We are so happy to have him here. Please. Yes. The discussion will be led by experts on these discussions. We have Fred Delano Sherman, who is the strategic advisor to the Canadian Ombudsperson, responsible for enterprise from Global Affairs. Is he here? Yeah, great to have you. Please come on stage. Please join on stage. We have architect Olusola, principal partner for Archi-Projects in Canada. He's here with us. If you can join us, please. Mr. Jonah Chininga, co-founder of CEO Woveo, if you are here. Thank you. And finally, we have Vainess Mollel, High Commission. She's coming from the High Commission of the United Republic of Tanzania. She's here. Very nice panelists we have. So we'll be diving into it. Aaron. I didn't go. Oh, sorry, Mr. Aaron, because I recognize him again. Mr. Aaron Pando. He is from the High Commission of the Republic of Zambia. And so we need one more seat. Sorry about that. Thank you so much. So please, let's give them a round of applause again as they. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Well, good morning, Dr. Ayolade, distinguished guests, and everybody who's been an absolute key part of this event. It's my pleasure to have joined today, this morning, fresh from Toronto. And as president of the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business, I just want to commend the CASA Foundation, which I've always known from the time I arrived in Canada from South Africa as an organization committed to collaboration. And it's truly an honor to be a part of this conversation, but really to be engaged with those who are leading the charge. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is the world's single biggest free trade area, as we all know, measured by number of countries participating. And that happens at a time where there's been a retreat from trade in some quarters, and to see the leadership on the continent, which I was privileged to witness at the African Union's extraordinary summit in Niger, I think is testament to the energy that is really going to define the place of the continent in the geopolitical and geoeconomic realities going forward. So with that context and with the extreme privilege of introducing just very briefly our speakers, I'd like to turn for some opening remarks and introductions. And so Fred Delano Sherman, Strategic Communications Consultant in the Government of Canada at Global Affairs. The floor is yours to kick off with a brief introduction.
2 minutes or
2 minutes
time?
is great.
Well, thanks, Gareth, and obviously thank you to everybody for taking that opportunity to be here and talk about issues that are so very important to us. Obviously, the issue of Africa is one that is of primary concern to Canada, as well as multilateral opportunities around the world. Many of us in this room have a connection there, and when we talk about, I've heard references to the change we want to see, or in this case, the Africa we want to achieve. I think conversations like this are really, really very important, so I too am looking forward to not only participating with these my distinguished co-panelists, but also perhaps learning a little bit more about how we can collectively get there. So I've had a good opportunity to work in this space my entire career with respect to international development, with respect to systemic challenges we face in the Canadian diaspora. So I won't hog the mic, but I'd lovely pass the microphone to. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. I'll be bringing the private sector perspective to this because I see that distinguished panelists are diplomats and experts in this field. I'll be looking at whichever area from the private perspective to see what can be done. From my background as an architect and developer, we collaborate with different sectors of the economy. So that will be what I'll be bringing here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jonah.
Hi, everyone. So I'll maximize my 2 minutes. My name is Jonah Chininga, fluent from Calgary, Alberta. So a little bit about me. I was born in Zambia, raised in Zimbabwe. I grew up in a hyperinflation crisis. So if you guys know anything about Zimbabwe, we had the $100 trillion notes and everything that happened during that time. But it was a very difficult time for my family. And then to escape that harsh reality, I had to move to Canada. And my goal was to be able to come here and be able to support my family that I left back home. But then the reality was a bit different, right? I was low income, I didn't have any credit history, and that made it a bit challenging just in terms of cost of credit, the ability to be able to support the people that I cared about. So inspired by that experience, I co-founded a company called Woveo. Because really I realized that the system was not working well for me. So how can we be able to use innovation to provide alternative solutions? And then for us, we created a community banking platform. And this was actually inspired by something that I saw my parents, my grandparents do back home, whereby they leveraged their collective savings as a way for affordable credit. So for us, we have leveraged technology to be able to utilize that same system to empower communities. Because just to provide context, in 2021, Canadians, low-income Canadians with credit scores under 700, they paid a staggering $62 billion in interest fees. So when you put that into perspective, you realize that we are just working just to get by and we're not moving ahead. So we wanted to be able to provide those alternative solutions. So far that has been working well. We have raised $3.5 million. We're working with 280 communities, and we're actually seeing a 99.1 repayment rate within a community banking system. So that's something that we're pioneering, and then I would love to share more perspective from an entrepreneurial perspective on how those solutions can be able to bridge the gap between Canada and Africa. So thank you.
Fantastic. First Secretary, Vainess Mollel, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Vainess Mollel from Tanzania High Commission. I know most of us, we are used to embassy, but if you're in the Commonwealth organizations, we call High Commission. So this is my third year of tour of duty in Canada. Before that, I was working with the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the United Republic of Tanzania. And currently what I'm doing within the High Commission is to help Tanzanians that want to bring their product to Canada, and also like every Canadian looking for investment opportunities in Tanzania, we connect them with all that. But I'm always passionate to see African countries are able to trade more among or between ourselves, rather than even looking market outside the world, because it's already a very big and lucrative market that we should tap into. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And First Secretary Pendwe from the Republic of Zambia.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Aaron Pendwe from the High Commission of the Republic of Zambia. First Secretary Education, as well as Trade and Economic. I'm so excited to see that we have a private sector on the panel. My background is mainly from the private sector, so I've only been with the government for 2 years now, 3 years rather, and it's pretty exciting. So there's a lot of ideas we're trying to bring into place and see how our drive for economic diplomacy can be improved going further. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, First Secretary. Welcome. So with such a breadth of expertise, Fred, I think I'm going to kick it off to you, mindful that you've been advising both governments and various agencies across Canada. So talking about the integration of a single African market and the moves towards that. People have identified differences in regulation between existing countries, some logistical issues, even language barriers by some sociologists. If you look at all of that and you look at the progress towards free trade on the continent, what do you see as the main success drivers that are going to really enable the realization of the African continental free trade area?
Thank you very much for the question, Garrett. And that kind of the short answer is really obviously economic growth. I think free market investment, I think obviously with skills development, making sure that we look at issues of labor mobilization, how we're dealing with the differences with 56 nation states, and as you mentioned, the regulation has to call it the spaghetti mix, the spaghetti mold phenomenon, where folks are kind of really tripping over. So these are systemic challenges we face. I think when we look at solutions, one of the good things I'm saying, there's a slew of them really. But again, if I go back to my original thesis orientation point, talking about economic implements, I think the regional hubs, the regional economic communities is a good starting point, because on one hand, we're actually dealing with those systemic challenges that are faced within those countries, those nation states, if you will, but at the same time, they're also looking in a sort of contiguous fashion to countries within the region who may share similarities in geology, similarities in perspective, similarities in if you will, aspiration. So if we look at the north, you got Maghreb, that hub. In the east, you got the Eastern African states. West, we got the Economic Community of West African States. And in the south, you got the South African Development Community. So basically, again, like I said before, making sure that we deal, obviously there's a whole bunch of secondary and tertiary considerations when you get to that, but at a high level, we'll certainly talk about just kind of strengthening that, where locally and regionally organizations and companies and governments can look at those challenges within the regions and hopefully and collectively, as we start to address those things, poverty reduction, skills and growth, employment and job creation, then that will kind of filter to that ultimate goal of creating the Africa we want.
Fantastic. Could I ask you to weigh in on that? You've got project management experience. You're literally designing the buildings of the future. How do you see the integration taking place from your vantage point and industry experience?
It's slow. That's the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think the problem of Africa is that of unity. If you look at the model of Europe, for instance, you'll find that countries come together and it's kind of borderless. You can go from Spain to Germany to other places. Trade is free. In Africa, it's not the same. In actual fact, Africa started that with ECOWAS from my own area, the West Africa. ECOWAS started the borderless. We share the same passport and all that, but the logistics of getting things done, to move goods from Lagos across the border, it's next to impossible. The custom exercise are not liberalized in a way that you can transfer goods easily across borders. Having said that, we're on the path to it. Yeah. It's just that we need the forceful determination to get this through. In the event of getting things together to make sure that the free trade, the economic situation in Africa is getting better, we need to work more on the laws that govern this area. You know, we need to work more on freeing this system, freeing the laws that guide our trade, for instance. We need to expand the trade between countries, even within the African sector, and create a system whereby the blocks can then export their goods to the West. If we continue to trade and compete indefinitely like we do right now, you'll find that some countries will be less privileged. And some countries will just be rising without taking the others along. And that's the inequality that is happening right now in Africa.
Thanks very much. Just a quick question on that point of the different markets. One of the things I saw in SADC once is with new drone technology, and of course we'll get into the technology expert in a moment, but one SADC country had not yet developed a set of regulations, another has, and they said, look, in order to move drones in terms of the goods between countries, we'll simply recognize if it's approved in your country, we accept it in ours. Fred, perhaps with your experience, to what extent can these, what some would call quick wins, help in, instead of having to always go through a widespread agreement, just countries reciprocating by recognizing if legislation and standards in one is accepted, we can accept it in another. And of course, any practical thoughts you have as well, Ark, on that from a business perspective would be great.
Okay, so regulations, it's something that you have to first discuss within your nation and agree to it, and then take that model to expand it to your region, and then from there you can expand it to Africa. But the issue is, even though we call ourselves Africans, but there's so much diversity culturally. There's so much diversity even in terms of the way we look at different aspects of life. So it's going to be difficult, except African leaders do come together to forge a common goal, which has been difficult lately, If they can come together and forge a common goal, then legislations and regulations and all that can be easily adopted and achieved. For instance, in Nigeria, next door neighbor, Cameroon and Republic of Benin, they are French-speaking. You understand? So that is already a kind of challenge, African leaders should come up with a new policy that, like Canada, that we adopt French and English together as a common language for Africans, so that it's easier to communicate. It's easier to bridge the cultural divide among nations. And then it's easier to come up with standardizations and regulations that will help us in promoting our industries.
Thanks very much. Fred, any added thoughts on that before we move over to Jonah?
Just very, very briefly,
Sure.
and thanks for that. Obviously, there's a whole new space of conversation we have about the utilization of French and English as, in terms of us in Africa utilizing that to communicate effectively. I think the point that I think you're conveying, and to get to Gareth's question, it gets back to what I keep talking about, the regional economic communities, because we speak about diversity. Yes, that's endemic, not only within the context of the regional blocks, but even you get to the country levels, most people don't know my heritage is from Liberia, and even in that small country of less than 5 million, we've got like 16 different ethnic groups, and when you parse it further, you go into 32 and more, so you're talking different language. So it's really, like I said, we talk the spaghetti bowl where it's very, very difficult. So coming at a higher level, what do we do here? I think getting back to those regional enclaves, sorry about that word, community groups, coming together on shared cultural pieces, whether it's in that West African space, the Mana River Union, or around the Nile, or in the Southern African region, where you have understandings, pre-existing understandings, if you will, about what's important, what's like. Obviously, the little countries, the smaller countries, get trampled in that mix because, once you start getting around the table, who he or she that wields the most influence certainly will get the better end of the bargain. And that's the same when we go north-south conversations, whenever Africa has fragmented and separated as we are, have conversations with these existing bigger countries through various multilateral fora. So short answer, yes, indeed. I think we can learn that. There's a lot of injective pieces we can bring in there. I think it's starting to happen, but it would be a matter of collaboration, which is largely aspirational, but again, that's why we're having this forum, right?
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Jonah, you, though you're an entrepreneur and you've raised money and you've got a successful business, and now the World Bank defines you as an expert on financing, and of course we're privileged to hear you on the issue of trade. How do you see the digital platforms and other technologies, the type that you engage in, that you're creating, help in actually implementing this free trade agreement? Any reflections on that?
Yeah, so I think technology can actually enable mainly two things. One is trade, as you say, the biggest principle is how can we build a trust infrastructure for trade to happen? How can we be able to use technology to be able to enhance transparency as well enhance kind of the convenience of being able to trade between one another? And we can use examples of like how the cost reduction of remittances, for example. When I came to Canada, it was costing me at least $20 to send $500, but then that cost has gone down by adopting technology, but then also providing a convenient way that can enable me to have transparency and then build trust using those systems. That's the first one. The second one, which I think is key, and then Africa has done it before, is the adoption of new technologies. For the sake that we are behind, we're able to leapfrog existing technologies and go to the new one. We did it with mobile money. M-Pesa invented mobile money, and then that was a new technology because we were able to leapfrog the telephone technology at that time. So how can we use that ecosystem? How can we use that same system to adopt AI, right, to be able to reduce cost, to enable more people to participate within the economy? I think leveraging those two things, we can be able to bridge the gap and enhance more people to be able to participate within the ecosystem. And then lastly, I think around technology, before we even get to the technology, I think there are examples and case studies that we can look at. And then for me, the biggest one that I'm always inspired by is how the Chinese immigrants did it when they came to Canada and the US, and then they were able to leverage their diaspora to be able to bridge the gap between trade between their home country, and then also enable like their own innovation within the Chinese market and bring it to Canada. So for example, M-Pesa, when they had the mobile money technology, can that be exported to Canada instead of just being an African-only technology? So I think there's opportunity for us to think bigger. I think there's an opportunity for us to be able to go international, both within Canadian businesses, but as well as African businesses who can be able to go international and actually grab that market share.
Fantastic. And just a quick question, in terms of industries here in Canada, where you're seeing entrepreneurs who could be key partners on the continent, any that come to mind beyond technology, perhaps agriculture, or other areas of expertise?
Yeah, so the main two ones that I see is one, fintech. I think there's a huge opportunity to be able to mobilize capital, especially within the diaspora ecosystem. As Africans, some of us, we don't trust our banks back home, right? So can we leverage the governance infrastructure that is here? Because you know that it's transparent, it's robust, and then you can actually enable that capital mobilization to be able to invest back home. The second one, which I think is key, is education. I think with AI, you can be able to create like virtual tutoring to be able to expand access to education. To kids, you can actually translate that education to be in the context that they understand. So I think there's a key, massive opportunity there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. First Secretary Mollel, obviously we're looking at the bigger picture, and from the point of view of governments and countries across the continent, it's much more than just economic. There's human development and flourishing that is key. So how do you see the African Union or the role specifically of free trade in delivering on some of the broader issues of poverty alleviation and sustainable development? And within that context then, how do you bring that back to the private sector, and what's the message you give the private sector on the role that they play within this?
Thank you very much. I see African Continental Free Trade Area is beyond having borderless continent. It's about jobs creation through trade. Most of the questions that you receive at the High Commission from people back home who are doing agricultural products and they want to export it to Canada is that, can you please connect us with people who can, we can have a joint venture, we'll be able to add economic value to what we are producing instead of like exporting raw materials, primary products. At the end of the day, we're also exporting jobs abroad. So through African Continental Free Trade Area, it will attract even foreign direct investment. Like now, people will see, well, why should I go investing in energy sector in the country, only in Tanzania? But if you have this regional, the very large market of 1.3 billion, people say, well, they are producing and they are selling more, because like if the production is there and there is no consumption, automatically production will cease. So it will open many doors for foreign direct investment and eventual job creation. And also, if there is a robust job market in the continent, it will stimulate demand, and the stimulation of demand will further increase the trade. So it will be a cycle of prosperity within the continent. So it's beyond just having like a borderless continent to enable people moving from point A to Z. Like I'm in Tanzania today, I'm tired, let me go and chill in Kenya, then I'll come back. No, it's purposely to increase the trade at the end of the day, to increase, to create jobs for our people, and reducing poverty and eventual sustainable development. Yeah. With regards to private sector, I would say private sector is a key player in the African Continental Free Trade Area. The rest are the processes: eliminating non-tariff barriers to trade, reducing tariffs. Those are the process. But they're the one to own the agenda and drive it. They're the one to advocate for trade policies, what to be done for them to be able to trade among ourselves and all that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. First Secretary Pendwe. The same question to you, sir, both how you see the broader human implications and development of the continent, and of course the role of business. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, so when you look at the African Continental Free Trade Area, I think its building blocks really, it's from the small regional trade areas that were there before, like ECOWAS, SADC, thank you, and COMESA. So when you look at how successful those have been, we have a platform to look at to say how would the African Free Trade Area be successful as well. One very good example is its aim is to break down the trade barriers. So currently, it's very difficult for commodities to move between countries within Africa. It's easier to export. And ideally, this is what they're trying to change and encourage more trade intra-Africa. When you look at the current setup, it's basically extraction of resources, raw materials from Africa, and being taken to Europe, China, and the Americas. Ideally, what we want is value addition to be done within Africa. And that obviously conversely will reduce will reduce poverty, in that we'll have Africans employed in those value chain processing plants and manufacturing plants as well, etc. Obviously, with more jobs created for the local indigenous African, there'll be more prosperity, on the continent, and we'll see development going on. How the private sector would really come in and benefit from the African Free Trade Area, like she said, the private sector is the driver. I think 90% of investment in Africa is from the private sector, and ideally, what we would need them to do, what would encourage them to do, is to come and invest into processing, value addition, manufacturing plants right in Africa. In this day and age, why should we be importing second-hand vehicles when we can assemble them locally there? Why should we be exporting raw copper and import it back as cable? So those are the basics that we need to look at, and that's where the private sector can come in and take advantage of the Free Trade Area Agreement, in that just within Africa there's a huge market where trade can take place at a reduced cost, because you don't have to import it all the way back from China after you sent it as a raw material. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Fred, a lot of discussion, key opportunities for the private sector, but that's of course participation in a United Continental Free Trade Area. Do you see a specific role for the private sector, not just the government, in the actual implementation of the Free Trade Area? How do you see that?
Well, the short answer, of course, yes. But the bigger question is, how is that going to happen? Again, if we go to that dynamic that we're blessed and perhaps cursed with at the same time, which is the great diversity in terms of not only in terms of geography, sociology, and such, but just in terms of the political institutions and political will. If we fantasize about laissez-faire economics, free market, then there's a chance. But when we start looking again at how our countries and our regional interactions are set up, it's very much, and it has to be self-righteously guided. The priorities of the government of the day, the priorities of the state, and some of these transgenerational pose systemic blocks to any progress that, again, liberalization may bring about. So it's a conundrum, really, Gareth. It's like chicken or the egg. When you start looking at solutions, you start looking again at, hopefully, again, in those regional spaces, we're having those conversations that deal with tariffs and non-tariff barriers. How do we remove those? How do we drop that? When you look at, holistically at the African continent, we're looking at 17.9% of the world's population that's what we constitute. But yet, and still, you talked about export. We're only doing 3%. So there's an imbalance. And even when we're talking about export, and we're talking about primary goods, so conversations need to happen. Again, there's all these non-starter circumstances. Again, tribal, government of the day, parochial interests. So we can go deeper and deeper, but in terms of short-term solutions, yes, the private sector does have a role, and I think it's using that will, and hopefully, that agitation over a period of time that governments can see it is in their interest to kind of engage the private sector to hopefully find collaboration on targeted goals and then working together, perhaps achieve those.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Fred. The previous speaker set a precedent by inviting the floor to ask questions, so I don't want to dominate the conversation, but I would like to ask if there's anybody in our last few minutes who'd like to address us. We have one, and then we'll come over to you, sir, and then our third question. All right. Excellent. Do we have the roving mic? Otherwise, feel free to project your voice, whatever's preferred. Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Good morning. I just had a quick question. In the emerging era of the digital economy, what do you think governments or institutions can do to further leverage digital technologies to potentially minimize barriers to accelerate trade?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'll take the second and the third question. Jonah, sounds like that one straight to you. And our second question, thanks very much. And I just would like to say to the panel as well, feel free to weigh in on any aspects as well, if you wish. Second question.
I just want to thank the panelists. Amazing conversation. My question is an area of, we've had conversations around value addition. I think it's brilliant. But something that comes to mind is, whilst we are chasing value addition, what are we doing with the current structures, what we have right now? And I'll direct this straight to the area of mining, for instance, because you referenced copper, right? Right now, there is acute inefficiencies that exist even with how mining is happening and how those mined materials are moving, and there is significant loss of dollars that is happening, with the money, the bulk of the money, or money not being left for the local mining communities. Do you think there is a lot of work still to be done with ensuring efficiencies and ensuring that we are doing well with what we have before we begin to, whilst we are chasing those value addition processes, because those will come with its own complexities?
Thank you very much. And the third question in this round. That's, it reminds me of a comment: planning for the economy you have, not yet the economy you want to have. So I saw a lot of heads nodding. Our final question, and then we'll come to the panel.
Hi. Hi, my name is Varishka. I'm originally from South Africa, now living in Toronto. So one of my questions is that I think one of the greatest challenges as being an entrepreneur from South Africa is stereotypes. And even in this time of globalization, and it's been countless times I've been asked, like when I say that I'm from South Africa, is that whether we have lions as pets and whether we have running water and electricity. So my question is, as a collective, how do we eradicate and challenge the issues or stereotypes so that future generations and youth do not confront these issues for the future to become entrepreneurs?
Thank you so much. First, so we'll go in order on the question of the digital integration. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, so with regards to the digital economy and digital integration, I see it in three, so I'll look at like three key stakeholders that are responsible. So the first one is, I think from an African context, there needs to be a lot more investment around IP protection, right? That currently doesn't exist. And then when you're looking at it from a global perspective, you can't compete if you don't protect your innovation in technology. Then from an African perspective, African diaspora perspective, I think we also need to be more risk takers. And the reason why I say that is, I'll speak for myself. For me, I know I'm part of the problem, right? When I came here as an international student, I was taking away, let's say, $25,000 out of the economy. You multiply that by 20,000 students moving out of the country, you can see the imbalance already within the economy. So when that investment is made and you come here and you learn and then you kind of like have this education, how can you be able to use that expertise that you've been able to learn, develop, experience to be able to impact where you came from? So I think there's an opportunity whereby we can take that responsibility, be risk takers, and create solutions for the place that we're coming from. And then the last one, from a Canadian perspective, I think Canada has an opportunity to be able to leverage kind of like what Delaware did in the US, whereby they made the state, it's a small state, but then they made it very business friendly for international companies to register within that market, right? So you're enabling those people to be able to come into a market that has robust governance, regulations, and policies, and you're bringing international business within an economy, and then that's beneficial not only to Canada, but then it's also beneficial to the international businesses looking to leverage that economy as well.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jonah. And on the question, either the first question or the second, how one works as you get towards the goals of value addition, what one does in the interim, from our esteemed first secretaries, any reflections there would be particularly great.
Thank you so much. I would like to comment on that question of the mining, because we're one of the best, in that extractive sector in the continent. So I understand every country has its own arrangement when it comes to the mineral sector. But for example, as Tanzanians, what you're doing, we have a corporation that is doing business on behalf of the government. And also there are a lot of rules and regulations that you cannot export like just raw minerals to other parts of the world. It has to be processed to some extent within the country before being exported. The thing that we are missing is technology. That's the only problem we have, but we don't want to take it as an excuse just to do that. So like for example, what the Tanzania State Mining Corporation is doing is to do business on behalf of the government. It can do business as it on its own or looking for the joint ventures with big companies, like you have got Barrick. Barrick is in Toronto, like is cooperating, working with the State Mining Corporation or working on its own, making sure that the minerals are processed within the country, even if it's not to the full extent, at least to some extent, before being exported to other parts of the world. And the other thing, you ask how are they giving back to the community? Like there is a percentage for every mining company. They have to give back to the community through education or whatever means, through corporate social responsibility. You see them building schools, helping the community in the mines and all that. So there is a way. I won't say like it's completely successful, but you're making steady progress. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the question on value addition, really it's about policy for starters, because if you look at most of the mining sector, you asked about copper, so I'll try and answer it broadly because I'll also look at other sectors as well. So when you look at the mining sector specifically, it's mostly run by the private sector. It's in private hands. Okay, so when we talk about value addition, we're saying that same product they're getting from Africa. Why is it that it can be developed further in another country? Why can't they do it from where they got it from before it leaves the country? That's one. Secondly, yes, there's still a lot of exploration going on. So meaning the governments and other entities that are there can strategically plan as they open up other areas that have been explored, such that value addition is already part of that strategy. And this can be achieved through consultation, obviously. I think Africa has got a very good diaspora community which is qualified. And the truth is, those are the people that can come back and manage those entities. And you know, they have the technical know-how, be it engineering, economics, mathematics, and all. The same applies when it comes to the education part of it, because we cannot transport the entire African youth to come and study abroad. So this is where I had collaborations being mentioned in the previous panel. This is where we need collaboration in terms of education for the population in Africa, the youth. Why not train them so that they're able to bring up and work on on these value add courses. I think there's always one example I always look at. If you go into agriculture, for example, Africa is Southern Africa, to be specific. There's a deficit in terms of food production, especially with the droughts going on. So why can't drone technology be applied when it comes to farming? Why don't we have research facilities which will help us to pinpoint areas on how we can improve our farming to work with the climate change, so to say, for lack of a better term, So yeah, basically that's how I'd answer your question.
Thank you so much, First Secretary Pendwe. I think Fred wants to offer some inputs as well on that question. And then I'm going to just come to the issue of narrative and stereotypes. Fred?
Yeah, very quickly, it's probably a bit of good news and not so good news. Going straight to the mining context, I've had the pleasure, if you will, of working with, I think the first of its kind, the Canadian Ombudsperson on what we call responsible enterprise, and that mandate involves looking at the behavioral practices of Canadian companies with respect to the mining sector, the garment sector, and the energy sector outside of Canada, around the world. And obviously, on the continent, with its vast wealth in mineral resources, and that, there's you mentioned some of the human rights implications. How you talk about remuneration and retribution, how you're dealing with the land, and all those things. So again, there's a whole bunch of other ancillary questions that come to apply. But again, when we go back to the root cause and think, how do we address this in an effective fashion? How do we start dealing with this? It's a good time. I think you mentioned this, my colleague from Tanzania, that at the ground level, we need to kind of start looking at how we utilize concepts like skills development, education, and those pieces, and bringing that to the table, and, environmental considerations. These things, the language we're speaking to the so-called North. So the good news piece, like I said before, I think here in the so-called developed world, there's some mindfulness about that. And I think locally, back home, back in Africa, we got to start thinking about how we ourselves can make sure that we at least move past political imperatives, who's got the sweetheart deals, and looking really at how it's affecting our indigenous populations, the local people, with respect to, again, access to opportunity, how it's affecting the natural habitat, and perhaps even the environment.
Thank you so much. And just any final comments, and perhaps touching on that issue of how we change the narrative, addressing some of the stereotypes, Ark?
Okay. I think Africa has got everything that it needs. Interestingly, if you poll Canadian students of African descent here, you'll find that we are probably trending maybe higher than a lot of other nationals from even Europe, from Asia sometimes. So we are not lacking in skills. I think the problem with Africa right now is leadership and policy making. Country like Singapore, interestingly, in the 60s, they were about the same level with Africans. But today, they are almost world power. Why? Because of leadership. You need to put in place policies that help the community to grow. Policies that will help people that you spent dollar amount to train abroad, to attract them back to contribute. It's like we keep sending them out, but no program to retain them, to ask them to come back and add value to the local community. I think these are issues, they are not really expert issues, but they are issues of governance and policies that Africa needs to look back into and resolve. If we don't resolve it, you can throw as much dollar as you want into Africa. It's just going to be another statistics that we're going to come back and discuss next year and say, okay, this much million has gone there. You know, there must be intentionality in terms of how we use these resources that we are putting together.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Jonah, perhaps the final word. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to also add another perspective just to around narrative. I believe the best way to change narrative is excellence. So, for example, the more better that we are as individuals, collectively we change the narrative. One good example I can give is around African music, for example, Afro beats, right? Having people like Burna Boy, it's a massive industry, and that excellence in music translates into people having a different narrative about Africa because they're seeing that talent. So I think as individuals, there's a responsibility that we can be able to take, that if you're excellent in something, and then collectively that adds up, and then that can be able to compound over a long-term process.
And Jonah, Chininga, you embody that excellence along with every single one of you as panelists today. Thank you for changing the narrative in what you're doing. And thank you as well